I'm joining you from Toronto. I am at Canadian Student Services Board meeting, and so it's great to be able to be in St. John's in this moment with all of you virtually, and to be able to run this session today. You're probably wondering a little bit about who I am, so let me express. At the moment, I have the extreme pleasure, I have to say, it's been a wonderful learning experience, as sitting as the Interim Associate Vice President Academic and Dean of Students. But truly, I am an associate professor in adult education and post-secondary studies in the Faculty of Education here at MUM. My experience is in post-secondary education, but with a focus on student affairs and services and student mobility. So I really worry a lot in my time about student transitions and some of those org structures and information frameworks that support their success. I'm really interested in how students access supports and then also how they proceed within their transitions in post-secondary, both within institutions, between institutions, and also into the labor market. As a formal K-12 teacher, though, I have brought over my SOTL Scholarship of Teaching and Learning to my work in post-secondary, and I do investigate quite frequently within my own courses and with teams of instructors across our faculty, various items relating to teaching and learning. So a bit of background, because we should always know who we are a little bit, and it's always good to get to know everyone. I know many of you here today, but for those who don't, this is where I come from. These are my two little guys, 2- and 5-year-old here, Evan and Liam, and they keep me grounded in all of this work. They're lovely. I am come from away in Newfoundland and Labrador, having moved from Ontario, but these two little men were born here, and so they are little Newfoundlanders, and they are loving it here. It's an excellent community, and we're so gracious to be here. Today, though, back to business, I want to talk to you a little bit about the rules of engagement. So engagement within our teaching and learning practices and our courses and curriculum. There are Tinto, the overarching, kind of guru of student success, says there's 5 conditions to really promote student success. There's, institutional commitments, there's institutional expectations, support, feedback, and then involvement and engagement. And they're all extremely important. But we know the last few years in post-secondary education, it's been a moment, let's say, and we have had to change how we engage students, how we organize events, how we continue, how we welcome them back to campus, moments where, things may not be well attended and we wonder how we can pivot, and how we actually work with students on the various initiatives that we have. What I think is interesting, though, and I want to talk about a little bit today, is rethinking engagement and persistence, though. Yes, Tintu laid a wonderful foundation, as well as Aston and others within the field of student success. But Tinto has revisited this, actually, to look at persistence through social networks. It's not just the social interactions of students, it's actually the networks that they form. And how do they form those networks in classrooms, curriculum, and co-curriculum? And he speaks a little bit about tight and loose networks, dense or sparse, and engendering some different outcomes from those. So from these rules of engagement, I'm going to walk you through 2 pieces. First are the 5 conditions. I want to talk about practically, within some research I do in this area, what we know about Canadian campuses around engagement and its role within retention and how we actually include faculty. And then I want to turn to this theoretical piece of the social networks and how we can practically, with some exemplars, actually put this into our teaching and learning. So let me walk you through a bit of an exercise here for a minute. So with regard to that retention piece, I conduct research in this work. I supervise in this work and I teach in this work. So with that being said, when it comes to retention and engagement in the classroom, I've been involved over the last 10 years in a large study. There are about 5,000 students involved, as well as faculty and staff across institutions in Canada, 7 provinces included. But one of the pieces that we ran, a slice of this research, actually looked at to set the stage today, retention and engagement of 21 senior academic leaders, as well as the student affairs leaders. So the position I'm in today. Those AVPA roles of student affairs, as well as the AVP roles of academic. And with that being said, when we interviewed those 21 folks, and you can imagine there are so many of them across Canada, so we'll remain anonymous here because they can be identified. What we noticed when it comes to retention and engagement is that the primary, responsibility when we asked folks for undergrad student retention, we found that at some of the institutions, 10, the majority, there really was no mechanism for institution-wide coordination of retention, and that at 3, there was a specific office, and that at some, there was actually both an institution-wide and a retention committee. So at 8, so actually, a bit of parsing out of the responsibility there and some parallel structure. So as you can see across Canada, a mixed situation for retention, especially when it comes to engagement of students. To further set the stage, when we asked these senior administrators, academic and student affairs, about targeted programs to engage students, especially with retention efforts, we heard quite a bit about the early alert systems, alternative to suspension, transition programs, academic advising, academic maps, and milestone courses. But you can see here that most of these are pretty well represented, but the academic advising and some of those other pieces a little less so, which is interesting if you're a faculty member. For me, this stood out as being quite, intentional and something that lives with students throughout their time. So the fact that it was least represented here can be a bit of an issue. For all of you, though, as faculty in teaching and learning, we also asked them about awareness. And we asked these senior administrators about faculty orientation and how they were actually engaging faculty in engagement, involvement, institutional commitment, and retention initiatives. And when it came to awareness of faculty, they reported that actually probably about less than 2 hours in faculty orientation is actually spent with regard to engagement, involvement, and all of those initiatives on campus at their institutions. Moreover, around awareness, when we asked them, how often do you do that outreach, though? We found that really it was more than once a term and, not much more than that. But you can see here that the websites and social media, the listservs and newsletters and informal meetings, all the informal communication structures were actually how deans and faculty were communicated on campuses, much like our own, with regard to some of these efforts for retention, involvement, partnership, etc. And you can see that they're really the informal channels, whereas the formal, the faculty-wide meetings and the institution-wide meetings, and some of the actually presenting at staff or faculty professional development events were actually quite low. So there's an opportunity here with regard to that engagement and how we actually network across institutions. Lastly, then we look at perceptions of culture, and these were the institutional partnerships, and I'll leave us here today with regard to some of this data to set the stage. But how often do you actually encourage folks in these senior positions, if you're faculty, to actually engage, as well as some of the student services members on campus with regard to this? And what we found is the encouragement level actually did vary according to where you sat. So we talk about the academic side of the house sometimes, and we talk about the student services side of the house. And here we can actually see the divide. When it comes to some of these academic program coordinators, department, faculty, etc., you can see that encouraged is generally the level of institutional partnership here, some of those network making. But when we look at the SAS supervisors and the SAS staff and students, these are the student affairs folks, we can see that actually the strongly encouraged, the bar is much more relevant here. And so you can see kind of the divide in the two sides of the house. I say all of this about some of the research to give a bit of background. If we have a bit of a divide in how we form social networks and partner on campus for student engagement and involvement, and that we don't maybe always include faculty, deans, and staff within some of those conversations about how we can network for student success and student involvement and engagement, then how can we expect our students to do that? How do we expect them to know how to maneuver an institution, especially if it's a new one, when us ourselves are trying to still see the communication and the partnership and work together on those moments? We have some great moments for success, absolutely, but we also have an opportunity here. So if you remember, the second piece was that theoretical model I wanted to return to today. And so this is the second piece before we get into some exemplars. Vincent Tinto originally put out the student integration model, a long time ago, and it has been maneuvered and manipulated several times over and over again. This is the typical model. You have the pre-entry attributes the students come in with, their goals and commitments. Then their institutional experiences. You can see the social system on the bottom there, the formal and informal. And this is where that new contribution of social networks comes that we're going to focus on today. And then we have some of the personal goals and commitments and then their departure decision. This was the original model that probably many of us know also well. And if not, this was, the kind of foundational model that you can head and look up. Where an interesting turn took, and where I want to focus today, because it's turned a bit of our thinking on its head, is after the pandemic, Tinto reflected. This is an elderly man at this time who's been in the system for a long time. He said, social engagement and peer relationships are really important, but it's actually the networks that matter. And so this article, you can see here, featured in Student Success, entitled Rethinking Engagement and Student Persistence, is where I want to jump off today a little bit, and how we think about how we can set up our classrooms and our curriculum and our online learning modules. This article actually talks about patterns of student engagement, something a little new. We've spoken about engagement and involvement before, but now we want to look at the patterns. And Tinto says here that students' social and academic behaviors are shaped by their social ties, we know this, whose behavior influences their own and vice versa. But there's also students' perceptions of their social integration into the institution, which really represent an important factor in their persistence. How they perceive their belonging, how comfortable they are, and their knowledge of the institution and how they can maneuver it, much like we spoke about the faculty and administrators and deans earlier, matters. That culture, the feeling, the tangibleness of that really does matter here. And Tinto says in this new article, and you can imagine, I'm not going to read this here, but there's really only so much he expresses that formally institutions and faculty can do. We can put in various formal ways of addressing this, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of informal engagements where students may actually, collision, run into one another, be in a certain event. We may actually have all of those elements where they run into us, our services, engagement, involvements, our faculty, that may actually be really informal. But be that the case, he says, it's entirely appropriate for us to ask what we can do to enhance student success. And that's where I want to pull us today. A couple of the items in the article that I want to focus on with my exemplars today practically are, when looking at the social networks, he speaks about and introduces a new concept called tight or loose or dense or sparse. These networks and the density of the network, whether it's tightly or closely or loosely knit, the student's location in it as well, are they at the center, or the periphery, or are they outside of it completely, matters. And he expresses that the denser or the more tightly knit a network is, the greater number of possible interactions among its members. So the more individuals and the closer they are and the more options for collision, the better. And that obviously the more central individuals are center of the network, and they're really important to that network, and the more interactions they may have with other members of the network, and that more connections really lead to more social support. So this is what I want to advocate for today in our teaching and learning, that we set up these, loose and sometimes very tight networks so that we can engage students, and we do so intentionally. I also want to talk about constructing nodes he pulls from the article today, and I'm going to weave that through some exemplars I give today. Students encounter each other and engage in those formal education activities. The classrooms are really this, whether they're online or not. All of my classes are actually online, so I can say whether you're in person or online, it does not matter here. These nodes in the campus networks connect students to other students on campus and actually other staff and faculty. And the micro networks in the classroom are also really important. And so we know that pedagogies such as cooperative learning and problem-based and project learning really require students to engage. These nodes, making sure we have a network of nodes and that students can interact with faculty, staff, administrators, and other students on campus, is really important within their sense of belonging and engagement. Reaching saturation is also really important. Tinto speaks about the fact, and others speak about, that networks are generally really erratic. Students come in first year and they're not sure where to be, who to connect with, what their courses look like, the students they're interacting with, but they shift from these loosely connected to more tightly connected academically and socially over time, and that the encounters lead them to participate sometimes in two or more networks, like compartmental networks. You can imagine you may be in a leadership position or opportunity over in student affairs. You may be in a career, workshop one day. You may be sitting in your economics classroom. You may be sitting in your business classroom. These are all those compartmental networks, but sometimes they do start to interact. And that two or more is really the moment where saturation hits, Tinto expresses. So we want to encourage students to learn about two or more networks. And that's part of what I want to express today. So connecting with a friend, regardless of location, may actually lead to becoming part of another network. So I want to workshop for a minute today and provide some examples in teaching and learning around how we can set up these social networks and why they're so important to have multiple nodes and to have students have various compartmental networks, two and more, so that they can actually communicate with one another, and why it's so important, as the research showed in the beginning, that we work together to set that modeling and that stage, and our awareness of the networks on campus is so important to encourage student success. So I'm going to pull back and forth between this slide and some examples in my teaching for you all today in terms of this engagement and networking for engagement in the classroom and curriculum. The first is a visual pedagogy. For those who may not know, a visual pedagogy is when you actually walk students through and express to them and explain to them why you're engaging in the pedagogies or andragogies that you are. And one of the things I do in some of my online courses, and I talk about student affairs in these courses, but it can be any subject or field, is that it's really important to walk them through this. So for example, I have these quick reminders every week in the online courses, and this can be done in courses face-to-face as well, where I walk through some of the reminders for every week, and I set the stage and the conception here, but I talk about why we engage in certain exercises. So for example, starting this week and the remainder of the course, we're actually going to introduce these announcements. And these announcements are going to include some media articles, research articles, blog posts, Twitters, webinars related to the concepts that are covered. And from a pedagogical perspective, I explain here the rationale includes the benefits of connecting these major concepts, but also learning about the debates and the innovative programs and governments and others involved in real time. Our classroom can be in real time. We can pull in these examples for social networking, and it's important that we do that. And I say to students, I want you to have a toolkit by the end. I want you to have a toolkit of all of the major stakeholders and players within this field. I want you to be able to name their names and draw on them and know what they produce. I also want you to know where you can receive really wonderful articles, policy, documents, government decisions within the field in which we work. And I also want you to know about the current themes and trends, and actually assemble all of these resources and sources into a bit of a folder or a repository that you can keep later. I want them, I say, to be able to mediate the media. It's important that they have this and they can establish that. And so one of the other pieces here is in these weekly announcements, and you'll see in my slides, if I go back to them for a minute here, is the introductions and communications are really important, and setting up these learning communities and some of these contracts with students. These introductions are so important because I'm walking them through how we're going to engage and set up the networks within our classroom and what that looks like. Part of those pieces then in these weekly are making sure that this is a live course. One of the ways social networking can be done, and I think the pandemic really forced us, is that whether the class is online or in person, we have a repository. We have all of these wonderful networks that we have available to us, and we can draw on them. So for example, if I'm teaching about post-secondary studies, I can draw on teaching and learning centers, as you can see here from other institutions. I can draw on self-directed learning processes that they put together in resources. I do this in the course every week by setting up, this is the topic for this week. When we examine, for example, here, prior learning and self-directed learning, let me pull out some live examples just this week of what we're seeing in the field so that they can relate it. This takes time and effort, but students also really appreciate this because they become a little more excited and engaged, but they're also forming the networks. These are now the external networks that I want them to build a little bit with regard to their work as a university student, or if it were a college student. And so you can see here I have them link out to the Teaching and Learning Center at Waterloo. I also, within this, link them back to some of the self-directed learning repositories that, they have available. And so it's really just about all of those wonderful resources, but it's really making those external connections, which is really important. You can see here the same for, if I use another example, we look at assessment in one of these courses in student services, and we can actually highlight some, this is a special issue that was put out with regard to the material we're working on. There's a whole journal that actually looks at this piece, and that they can use some of those resources as well. What's also important, and I don't have here because it may be a little more obvious, but it is important to say, we also have the internal networks we want them to make now. That research I spoke about earlier had the academic side of the house and the student services side of the house. One of the other things I introduce in all of these online courses, which can actually also be done in a syllabus or syllabi, depending on how many courses you have, is actually introducing the services and supports on campus. I'm finding quite a bit in my role right now as Dean of Students that we don't always know as faculty or have a great awareness to some of that research earlier about what some of those services and supports on campuses look like. So what is occurring in the Career Center? What's occurring in the Student Support Center? What's occurring in international education in the office? What's occurring at Juniper House, the Writing Center, the Blunden Center? How can students actually engage with these and set up networks, social networks for engagement and belonging on campus? And faculty play a good role here, and we play a role within our teaching and learning. So within our teaching and learning, I actually have a listing of these and explain to students, how they can be used. One of the things I'm working on now within my role currently is it would be wonderful to actually have a map, a visual map that we could embed in our courses and in our Brightspace shells that actually showcase how and where these services actually operate together and how they partner with faculty and us as instructors within the classroom and support our students. I used to be at the University of Toronto. And when I was at the University of Toronto at OISE, I actually worked on a project developing an app, like an online application where students could actually navigate across campus wherever they were on their phones, tablets, laptops, etc., where the services were, what questions they could ask, how they could support them with their teaching and learning, and how they could assist them with their classroom exercises. So for example, the Writing Center, if it would be mathematics and tutoring, student support for regard for emergency bursaries, et cetera, to keep students going, because we know that part of the work in the classroom is that content, but part of it is the social and emotional work we do, the heart work. The hard work that we noticed was really important during the pandemic. It became a little less about content some days and a little more about ensuring that students are there and supported, for the right purposes. And so that's one of the other pieces that I'm trying to embed. But we're talking about teaching and learning, and I have to absolutely express experiential and some problem-based learning. How do we make the networks in the classroom and the exercises, activities, and assignments that we actually engage within? So I'm going to provide a few examples of that here as well. One of the examples, it depends on where you sit. If you're not in HSS, you may find that you have a little less for maybe discussion forums or discussion groups or activities in your classes. But I would argue, being a SOTL scholar, that every one of you has an opportunity to actually do some of this work, whether you're in mathematics, science, economics, business, etc. I was absolutely frustrated with question and answer. We use this a lot as faculty, and I have to say I banned it. When I came to Memorial, I decided to absolutely ban this situation. Oops, sorry, my internet has collapsed here, so I'll go back to this example and log back in. But as I explain this, I absolutely banned this because I thought that it really actually wasn't all that worthwhile, and that students were really checking out. Let's be honest, engagement, this isn't engagement. This is a matter of passive learning. And so I put in something called place think blots. You may have something similar in your courses, but think blots, I explained to students in this visual pedagogy once again, is actually a problem-based learning. And we are going to look at a problem every week instead of Q&A, and we're going to look at apps for testing, virtual field trips, scavenger hunts, podcasts, videos, news releases, media, all of those pieces, and they're going to be actually asked to engage with these instead of a Q&A. But this is a little larger. This is a task. They're actually going to have to perform a task and a role here, and that's really important. And so with that, instead of answering blankly every week for 12 sessions, a Q&A, this is going to take a little more time, and it's actually going to ask that you go and evaluate policies, or that you go and look up other institutions, or you collect data, analyze it, etc. With that being said, I asked them to complete 6. There's 12 weeks, but I want quality over quantity. I want the learning to be there. My students are adult mature learners, but I've also taught a great amount of undergraduate courses, and this is really important. And so on the note of those exercises, and we're going to load here because it did collapse, I want to show you just what a couple of think blots actually look like. So the think blots here, and I'm going to have to scroll down, it lost my position, so I'm so sorry. But I want you to look at a little bit here. So you can see here the think blot actually has a description of what is being asked and then a bit of a task for this networking. And so here, for example, I link out to a faculty guide on experiential education at Brock University, as well as some examples. There's some other here that I like to draw on. The teaching perspectives inventory is really interesting. And so with that being said, they actually have to go and complete the teaching perspectives inventory, report back a little bit on their examples, and integrate a lot of the work that we're actually doing in the course for that week. And you can see there's a different one of these for every week, and that not all students are going to engage in every single one. And so they need to actually choose those that would be, the most important to them. But what's important here is that they're actually building a repertoire and engaging with others outside. So you can see I'm just going to pull up a couple, Harvard and their qualitative interviews here. One of the interesting things we study in the course is design thinking in this particular course, which is instead of engaging in designing services for students on a campus, which I can see in my current role, doing this with them. And so this is a great example here from the University of Toronto. They have an innovation hub that's student-driven design. And then we look through within that some of the past projects that they've done with actual exemplars. So in other words, students can actually see what they're learning in real time with other institutions and examples and make this live and exciting. So if we head back over here to some of these examples and workshop a little bit for a minute, these experiential and problem-based learning are really important. Not only do I now have students engaging a little more in these pieces besides Q&A, they have to, comment a little, they have to engage, they have to think through the material, they, actually form bonds with others in the course on this, but they also start to put together all those feelers for what the field looks like. And this can be done in any discipline or field. One of the other pieces that's really important, I believe, whether it's undergrad or grad, is scholar practitioner hybrid assignments. And what I mean by that is they should be able to see the scholarly piece that you're trying to educate them about, but also that practitioner piece of wherever they would actually sit within your work. And so I do this through some of the assignments in the course. And so what I mean by scholar practitioner is it should be valuable. They should be able to see something in the workforce around which they could actually structure some of their work. And so that's really important here. A couple examples then, in one of my courses, they actually have to design an innovative program for students. This is a student services course. They have to actually design, and I give a proposal. You're, got a chief student affairs officer, my current role, and you've actually been asked to create a proposal for a new program. You have to put that program together with some of the student development theory, and you have to actually describe some of the logistics for it, the budget, the space, all of these pieces, and a bit of a template. This is a template from various institutions that have been melded together here to actually look like a real live proposal that would go into a student affairs unit, for example. And so a lot of students in the course actually use this and come on out and use it in their institutions to put forward as adult learners various programs and options. One of the other pieces we do is we look at an actual situation that's occurring on a campus, and any of the items of effect. You can imagine right now we have EDI, Indigenous, we're seeing a great amount of social and emotional learning. And so this actually asks students, once again, a bit of a problem-based situation here with a task. You've actually been asked to put together a presentation around an issue in student affairs. Then you've been asked to actually put together a white paper and present this to your senior director, manager, etc., around how the institution should actually proceed with a current issue in the field. And with that being said, they actually have to review some data, material, literature, etc., and bring that forward. This briefing exercise that results, it starts with a briefing. It goes to a presentation among colleagues where they act as critical friends and actually finds, you can imagine some of the bonds they make in those critical friend groups. If you haven't used critical friends in your courses, I think this is a great piece for social engagement. Critical friends, it's not that we're going to be critical of one another, but you engage in small group work, but instead of typical work where they may work together, they actually present and interact with one another constructively. So we ask that they don't be disagreeable, but that they can disagree and that they can provide resources and sources to other folks. This has been one of the major pieces in the courses that I teach, in the sense that they actually form a great relationship with a core little group. Sometimes in our courses, they may be overwhelming. And so making those nodes we spoke about earlier, that compartmentalization, can be really important for students reaching out. A couple other examples here, and forgive me because a couple of them have gone by the wayside when it went down here. But if I load them, a couple other things that we do is we also look at some case studies within the field, and we actually apply actual ethical principles, models, etc. Most of us might have some type of ethical guiding principles, values, etc. in the work we do. If you're in medicine, if you're in nursing, those of you joining from business and accounting, if it's engineering. And so this actually works with those competency models that they might find out in the workplace, but brings them into a practical setting and combines them here within these assignments. So if we return back, these items are really important in the sense that they do find within our curriculum and our courses ways to actually make not only external relationships and networks, but also those within the larger campus between the academic and student services side of the house, and then within the classroom with regard to our content, but also our work learning, our work integrated learning, some of the pieces that we conclude if we spread across into what that will look like in the labor force. And so with that being said, those hybrid assignments, the problem-based, the experiential, highlighting some of those communities and networks that are already working to support student success is really important on campus and in our online courses. I spoke about the live courses and how important they are in those toolkits. I think this is the biggest piece for the networking. The more you can rely on in real time, those individuals at the institution, outside the institution, your colleagues in the field, all of us are doing research, all of us are doing some of this practitioner work, and bringing it into our teaching is really important. It adds a validity to the work, it adds an excitement to the work, and it adds a relevance to the work that students may normally not find. And so that engagement is really elevated. And the toolkits are really exciting for folks to bring forward, whether they're an undergrad student first entry or whether you're a grad student who's heading out for career advancement or upgrade or switching fields. These items are really important. And whether or not you sit within an education HSS field, or you sit in more of a science or mathematics field, these can be intentionally integrated, and there are wonderful examples across Canada. STELI, the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education in Canada, has a wonderful resources highlighting many of these examples. And so I encourage you, when we look at social networks and building those nodes and the networks and the compartmentalization and how we actually ensure students receive multiple touch points in terms of what we're teaching them, we have a role as faculty. It's really important. I sit in this hybrid where I'm the student services as well as that academic piece, but I will tell you that I fight a lot in my research and my practitioner work as well as my teaching to have a legitimate melding of those two groups. And there have been some wonderful scholars who have written about this in teaching and learning and talking about student success and engagement as a tapestry across campus where everyone actually has to come together and all the threads work together in order to support this. And so I want to express today that as faculty, we really have a role to build networks, associations, partnerships, involvements with others in our teaching and learning. These are just some examples that work well for me, but I'm sure you maybe have many others. And so I know we're going to engage in a conversation today. And so I want to be sure to do that with you all and leave some time for that. And I believe, Darlene, that we have a little bit of dedicated time now. So I'll stop sharing here if that makes sense. Okay, I think we have about 20 minutes, Darlene, if I'm not mistaken. I'm wondering a little bit from all of you, what you engage in, or how do you assist faculty? How do you assist staff? If you are a faculty member here today or a student, what actually examples do you see, or how do you encourage folks to engage in some of this kind of real-time learning, making social networks, informing individuals about other opportunities happening across campuses and within our own?